Our speaker today is Jacey Skinner. Jacey is an attorney, and part of the reason I've invited her is I think it's important for us at least once in the semester to have somebody that went to law school and is a practicing attorney. It's kind of a stereotypical political science thing to do, to go to law school, and I recognize that that's an interest of any number of people in the room, and so I think satisfying that to sort of at least talk about it with one person, sometimes two. So she's sort of she's filling the law school legal career lane for us this semester. Big weight to carry on your shoulders. She has significant public sector experience. So if you looked at the bio, you notice she worked as the general counsel for Governor Herbert. She, I think it was the administrative office of the courts in Utah, now with a law firm, Ballard Spahr, am I saying it right, that has an office in Utah, and continuing to do lots of public sector kind of work related to her earlier job in the government, in the Utah state government. But without, you've read the bio, she'll say more about her experiences, so I won't belabor that further. Let's welcome Jacey Skinner.
So first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I always genuinely enjoy getting to speak to classes, although every year it makes me feel, as I'm more and more separated from my time in school, it makes me feel older and older and older. But it just means I have more experience to share with you all. So when I was first invited to speak to this class a few years ago, can you hear me all okay? A few years ago, I was general counsel to the governor. And since that time, I've actually had several roles. So I hope you don't mind. I will talk about that job, but we'll talk about some of the others as well. As was just mentioned, I think since I am your only lawyer speaking this today, I'll talk about any kind of legal practice you want me to. At this point, I think I've had almost every kind you can imagine. But I do want to start with a raise of hands. How many of you have considered law school? So a fair number. I'll cover them all for you here. So when I was an undergraduate, I was a political science major at Utah State University, and I had actually started my college career as an engineering major. And when I decided to become a political science major, my dad made me promise to go to law school. That was the first thing he did. So I was considering it, but I was also considering a degree in public policy or public administration, and I wasn't really sure what to do. And partway through my college career, I did an internship in Washington, D.C. with the Senate Judiciary Committee. And when I was there, and this is kind of my first piece of advice to you all, while I was there, I took the opportunity to talk to anyone who had a job that seemed interesting to me. And I wanted to know what their background was and how they got there. And it turned out that almost all of them had a law degree. None of them were practicing lawyers, but they all had that legal background. They all had that kind of education in how to think and how to analyze and how to approach problems. And it had led them into these policy jobs that I found very interesting. And so at that point, I was still debating between different degrees, but as I continued down that course, it seemed pretty clear that all the jobs that I wanted, people had law degrees. And so that seemed like a good course to take. And so that was the reason that I decided to go to law school. I never planned to be a practicing lawyer. It kind of surprises me that I am one now. I always planned just to do policy work, but I wanted that background of being a lawyer. Before I kind of start, and I'm just going to walk you through my career, and I hope that's okay, and I'll give you some advice throughout. But I also want to say, if any of you have any questions, please feel free to ask at any point in time, because I am going to walk through a whole bunch of different kinds of legal jobs, and if there's one of those that's particularly interesting to you, feel free to ask then, and I can go into some more detail. My youngest brother is also a lawyer, and when he was just graduating from law school and deciding where he wanted to go and worrying about where his career was going to go, it kind of hit me. I think we do a disservice to you all sometimes when you hear people talk to you that are fairly well established in their career. They're jobs that you want, they're jobs that are interesting, but it makes it seem like everyone just kind of jumped to these cool jobs and cool positions, and you miss all the struggle in between and the finding what you really like and figuring out where you fit and finding the right break and all of those kinds of things. Just know everyone has one of those stories. No one just ended up as the governor's general counsel, or no one ended up as whatever they are. There are a lot of steps in between there. And so kind of the overarching thing that I hope you take away from this is every opportunity you get can be a great opportunity. Every experience you have can be the most important one. Every opportunity to learn something, no matter the area, if it's specifically related to what you want to do or not, can become really valuable down the road. So, I mean, I encourage, I do this now. I mean, it may be something that I don't really know that I'm going to have need for later, but no knowledge is bad knowledge, and it turns out more often than not, that little kind of side piece that I decided to help someone on or class that I went to ended up really informing something that I needed information on later. So just kind of keep that in mind as you go through. So as I mentioned, I went to law school not planning to be a practicing lawyer. But while I was in law school, I discovered that I actually really liked the practice of law. And so right out of law school, I decided that I wanted to spend some time in the courtroom, that if I ever wanted to do that, I needed to do that at the beginning of my career, because if I went and did a bunch of policy work, no one was going to let me in the courtroom at the end of my career. I needed to start there. And so I sought out a job at the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office. And so I started my career as a prosecutor, prosecuting first juvenile cases and then adult cases in district court, because I wanted that experience in court. And it turned out, and this is where I say no experience is bad experience, as I was there, again, just kind of asking people questions, it turns out that the head of the Prosecutors Association for the state of Utah was housed in that same office. And so when I met this individual, his name's Paul Boyd, and he's a masterful political figure in Utah history. He's done a lot of really great things for the state. When I met Paul, I kind of said to him, I'm like, well, you know, policy is what I've always wanted to do. If you ever need any help, happy to help you. Turns out that he needed help. And so almost immediately, he started asking me to help with different things. And I was happy to shadow him and follow him around. And he needed, you know, at different times, different things. And so I was really able to establish and get introduced to the world of Utah policy, which is not something that I had originally planned to move to DC and do policy work there. But I immediately became intrigued with the world of Utah policy because it's a world where you can identify a problem, you can identify a solution for the problem, you can get a legislative sponsor, and you can fix a problem all within a pretty short time frame. And that's really satisfying. And so I really did get kind of sucked into this world of Utah policy and problem solving and responding to policy issues almost immediately. And I have actually never turned back. It's been something that I found really rewarding in every facet that I've been through. So I'm gonna walk you through a few things and things that I've learned in these different capacities, but just to kind of walk you through them, I laugh at myself a little bit now. So I started as a prosecutor, then I did policy work at the state as the Sentencing Commission director. I had the opportunity to serve as general counsel to the governor, spent a short time working for the courts, and now I am a lawyer in a private law firm, and those are all very, very different jobs, but they all have a lot of similarities. And throughout my career, one of the things that I've noticed is that, you know, regardless of the world that you're in, there are very similar traits for people who are successful at what they're doing. You can probably guess what some of them are. Any ideas of what those kind of consistent traits of people who do well are?
Diligence.
Diligence definitely matters.
Having clarity on what you want.
Yeah. Clear direction absolutely helps.
Integrity.
Absolutely. So people who you know you can rely on, who are straight shooters, who don't try to lead you astray, who don't try to hide things from you, absolutely one of those top qualities. Responsibility, absolutely. So honestly, being that person that someone can rely on, that they can turn to you with a question, they know you'll get back to them, or that they hand you an issue, they know you'll follow up. Yes, following through and being someone can rely on. It's more rare than you would think, and definitely makes a difference. Any other thoughts? I'm going to walk you through, and some of these are going to sound maybe a little soft, a little hokey, but I share them with you in that the further I go into my career and the more areas that I work in, I am repeatedly struck by how important these things really are and how much they stand out with folks who just seem to have that gravitas or that professional demeanor that people are drawn to. As I mentioned, I've spent my entire career working with both good and bad public servants and good and bad professionals, and these traits really have played along in both lines. I think the core thing that I've seen, and this is going to sound a little crazy, is that people who maintain an element of humility throughout their career. You can see people who can really get into some very powerful positions in every sector, right? Whether it's in the private sector, whether it's in the public sector, whether they're elected, whether they're appointed, whether they just happen to rise to a certain area. The way that people treat that power or that influence really does make a difference. And someone can get into that kind of a position and lose that recognition of maybe where their authority comes from or why they're there. And they lose their influence very quickly. It's those folks who are able to really maintain that element of recognizing who they're working for, what their actual job is, why they're there, and not taking it for granted, that really make a great difference. Just a couple of examples of this. I actually worked for a judge right out of law school. And I was continually struck. He'd been on the bench for quite some time, I think, 15 years, I think, at the point that I'd worked for him, and was a very well-respected judge. And I was constantly struck by the fact that every time, I hope I'm not telling tales out of school here, but every time he'd get prepared to go step onto the bench, he'd put on his robe, he'd get nervous. And I was so struck by that he maintained that humility throughout doing that, recognizing that every time he stepped onto the bench, those people whose lives he was making decisions about, it was the most important thing to them, right? It could change their life. I always respected that approach that he took to things. The same thing with the governor. I loved the fact that the governor, and he says this repeatedly, that in working with people, that he recognizes that he was elected by a certain segment of the population, but once he was elected, he's there to represent and to govern for the entire population, right? Not just those who elected him. Those kinds of perspectives really make a difference in the way that people lead. I've seen that in the private sector as well, right? People who take responsibility for their employees, people who take responsibility for their clients, who do those things, who are there to help and serve and try to come out with the best outcome rather than making it all about themselves. So I know that sounds like kind of a soft quality, but across the board, those are the people that folks turn to. Just yesterday, I had the opportunity, I did have the opportunity, one of my family members had an issue that they were dealing with that was unreasonably complicated. And I was listening to it, I'm like, that sounds crazy. And I am not an expert in that area, but the governor's cabinet person who's over this area is, and I'll bet they'd call. So I called them to just ask the question, and they followed up with a text. I thought this was just so kind, saying, thank you so much for calling. Thank you for thinking of me, for letting me help you solve your problem, where I felt like I was imposing. Those kinds of things really go a long way. And just so keep that in mind. It's really easy sometimes to get, an ego associated with positions, and those who avoid that really do go a very long way. I saw the same kind of thing in the prosecutor's office, right? I mean, think about all the different prosecutors. There's a lot of power that go along with those positions. You get to make charging decisions. You decide whether you charge someone or not. You decide what level you charge them at or not. You decide if they get a plea deal or not. You make sentencing recommendations. You do a lot of different things. And I saw prosecutors who were very unwilling to listen, who became very enamored with their own power. Sometimes in those instances, that person has more power than the judge in making those initial decisions. And those who recognized, again, that these were people's lives and these were very important decisions and would listen, and those inevitably who were very well respected and who really made a difference were those who listened, right, and who were willing to work with other people. Those who weren't, frankly, sometimes were a little bit dangerous. Being a prosecutor, and I'll talk about this, and this is the first public sector job that I really had, it's a fascinating job. It really is. It's one of those areas where you get to work for the public. You are truly a public servant. You are working directly with victims. The kinds of things that you're dealing with on a daily basis can be pretty tough. And you walk away with some pretty kind of heavy emotional things every day. Whether it's people who have had their homes broken into, or even just dealing with people who have drug abuse issues and alcohol abuse issues, versus to victims who have been harmed physically or in other ways. It can be a really trying kind of a job, but a fantastic opportunity to really give back and to serve and to do that. And it really, if there are those of you who are considering law school and like trial work, I mean, I will say you spend every day in the courtroom, and there is no other job like that. I've not had a job since then, and I doubt I ever will again, but I miss that. I miss being in the courtroom every day, getting to make arguments, constantly writing motions, doing jury trials frequently. That kind of active, there's a reason they make a lot of TV shows about these jobs. They really are some of the most fast-paced, trying, but rewarding jobs that you can do. And before I move on, does anyone have any questions about that kind of work, whether it's on the prosecution side or on the defense side? Yeah.
How do you know if you like the track? Like, there's a lot of stuff you can do as a lawyer. How do you know if you want to do that?
You know, that's an excellent question. And it was interesting. Walking into law school, it was really interesting to see folks, some who walked in thinking they knew exactly what they wanted to do, right? They said, you know, I want to practice corporate law, or I want to practice this, or I want to practice that. Most of us had no idea, and a lot of those who said they knew had just kind of picked something out of the blue. There's really no way to know unless you've had some exposure to it and some experience with it. Practice of law is very different from track to track. And there are many folks who work in a corporate world who do, you know, even in my firm, we have our litigation team. Those are the folks who try cases, right, and go to court and do that. We have our real estate team, and they deal mostly with contracts and development and licensing. There's all sorts of different tracks. There's really no way to know without doing it. And so I highly encourage folks, take classes in the areas that you're interested in, but also seek out those opportunities to talk to practitioners, to do internships, to do externships, and to do that. And if you don't love something, don't be afraid to try something else. I have a lot of friends from law school who kind of put themselves in one particular track and felt like they had to stick with it, and they're not the happiest professionals. It can be a really, really trying career path. Being a lawyer is a stressful one at its best, and if you're not doing something that you find rewarding, it's the worst. So take every opportunity you can to just have some exposure to it. One of the best days of my career, honestly, I always wanted to do policy work, and it was the first year that I started working up at the legislature, and that's what I always thought I wanted to do. And I went up, first day I had a bill that was, my responsibility, and I went up to talk to some legislators, and it was crazy, and I was really nervous, and it was a, very nerve-wracking experience, but I walked away saying, I liked that, and I'm really glad that what I thought I wanted to do was, something that I actually did enjoy. So, does that answer your question? Any other questions in that regard? Yes?
So being like a prosecuting attorney and a state prosecutor, how is that how's that for your family? Is it like you put a lot of strain? Is it difficult?
So I think it is, yeah, on folks. It's a very trying job. It's one that you don't always get to control your schedule. You have trials and they go late. But that's true, I'll be honest, for the entire practice of law. Deadlines, trials, court deadlines, client issues, those tend to have to override your life in general. And so the practice of law is one that can be very difficult on your personal life and on your family. It has its rewards as well. And I've had some jobs where that's been easier to control than others. And so doing that one's a little easier. In working for the government, you don't have the billable hours, but you do have some additional stresses on top of that. There are areas where you're going to be on call, right? You've got to approve warrants. You've got to be there for law enforcement. You've got to do trials and things like that. It can be rough. To me, the most trying thing was just the types of cases that you're dealing with all the time. While important and interesting, can be kind of taxing. My family used to give me a hard time that I was a little paranoid, and I would tell them, you have to understand that literally every situation I see is the one that turned out badly. I never see anything that turned out okay, right? That person who harassed the driver next to them got shot, and that person who harassed someone in the park got shot, or, nothing ever turned out well. So that was the most trying part on me, as I just started to distrust the world. Any other questions in that regard? So moving on from there, so I had the opportunity. That was a fantastic job, and I actually miss to this day the opportunity to be in court. I will, like I said, never have the opportunity to get to engage those advocacy skills in that way again. It is very rewarding, and it's fun. It's really fun despite the difficult nature of it. When I was serving in that role, as I said, I also got to do a lot of policy work, and so I had, for me, the best of both worlds. I got to spend half my time in court and I got to spend half my time working with the Utah legislature doing policy stuff, and it was really fun. I got to do that for several years, and then Governor Huntsman at the time, his office called and asked me if I would be willing to direct the Utah Sentencing Commission, which was not anything I had ever imagined. I didn't know what it was. When I was in law school, I would have never even imagined that was a job. That's something you'll find, like these areas that interest you. But because of kind of the circles I'd put myself in that world, that opportunity opened itself up. And so that's one of the other things I like to advise young professionals and students about is, again, taking opportunities to help, taking opportunities to learn things, taking opportunities to meet different individuals, can really open doors that you didn't know existed. Again, we know some very defined types of jobs. We don't know the majority of them. And so when you put yourself in paths of areas that interest you, you will learn more things about that world that interests you. And those different kinds of doors and opportunities open up. So again, just taking advantage of those opportunities. Had I never, offered to help Paul and put myself in that world, I would have never got to know these folks. But because I was there, I worked very closely with what's called the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, which is part of the governor's office, as well as the Sentencing Commission, and when they, had an opening, when their director left there to go, received a different appointment, I had the opportunity to do that, which was also a really fun job. I've had a lot of really fun jobs, so I will tell you, I feel very fortunate. At the Sentencing Commission, I had the chance to just do pure policy work. My job, by statute, was to run a commission that advised the governor, the legislature, and the judiciary on criminal sentencing policy and rules, essentially. So my commission published what's called the sentencing guidelines, which are the rules that both judges and the Board of Pardons and Parole use when sentencing someone. So when someone goes before a judge, they use these guidelines to help direct where someone's going to be sentenced. And then if they are sent to prison, when they come up for a parole hearing, the Board of Pardons and Parole uses these same guidelines. So that was what my commission was charged with. We also helped come up with legislation to help address different sentencing issues. We worked really closely with the legislature. I did a lot of training for judges. I worked very closely with the governor and spent a lot of time with the legislature helping them develop policy and advising them as different bills came up. It was it's probably the most fun job I've ever had in getting to do that, just pure policy and working with everyone across the board and doing that. We also got to do some really important work. And this is where I say, again, no knowledge is bad knowledge and no experience is bad experience. When I started my career as a prosecutor, I started in juvenile court. That was my first assignment. And I loved working in juvenile court. It was probably the most taxing of all, just seeing some of the circumstances that a lot of these kids were in. I would look at a lot of them and say, it made me very grateful for the circumstances I had grown up in. I think in many instances, most of us, had we grown up in a lot of those circumstances, would have ended up in a lot of the exact same situations. And I really was struck by, in many instances, how our laws were really working against them progressing and against their ability to overcome different obstacles or ever to move on past a mistake when someone was 14 or 15 years old, and that was going to define them for the rest of their life. So when I became the Sentencing Commission director, those things were at the top of my list. And so we had a really great opportunity to really affect some really great legislation to help correct a lot of the laws in our juvenile our criminal code as they affected juveniles. And we were able to start a lot of things that to this day are still moving along and we're still making progress, and which is really fun. So, in my whole career, I think I look back at some of those things as some of the things that I've been able to do that made the biggest difference and probably will forever. But just a great opportunity. In that job, I also had the really cool opportunity to work closely with the governor as he appointed judges in the state of Utah. And so I got to interview candidates for judgeships and vet them and do background checks and do all of those different kinds of things and then advise the governor as he made those appointments. As a lawyer, that was a really unique and cool opportunity. As I became his general counsel, I got to continue in that role. So for about 9 years, I advised the governor on all of his judicial appointments, and it was a really, really great opportunity to do that. But I kind of want to go back. So in the role as the Sentencing Commission director, I just want to emphasize those kind of characteristics that I saw of folks who were successful and those who were not. carried through in every capacity. So those who I worked with who led agencies, who led nonprofit groups, who were judges, who were on the Board of Pardons and Parole, who were legislators in all of those different capacities, those folks who really just wanted to do a good job, who were honest, who didn't try to hide things from people, who didn't try to mislead people, who kind of kept a really good sense about what they were there for and what their purpose was, who treated people well. Those things across the board held through to those who were successful, those who people wanted to work with, and those who they didn't. One of the other things I learned really quickly was, and this again is going to sound silly, but just how important it is to treat people well throughout your career. You will probably all go all over the place, and different legal markets or different professional environments are all very different. But here in Utah in particular, we live in a really small world, and you're going to end up working with someone in one capacity or another. And it never fails to surprise me how many different venues I start to see people in again. Right? So there were defense attorneys that I worked with as a prosecutor who were not kind to me, or who did not treat me well, or who were not honest with me, right? Or who did different kinds of things. And later on had applied to be a judge. And suddenly I was the person on the other side of the table, right? Interviewing them and listening to their answers and vetting them and doing, that kind of a situation. Likewise, one of the first appointments that the governor made was Justice Lee, who is a professor here at BYU Law School. He was my civil procedure professor in law school, and it was really awkward for me, frankly, to be interviewing my civil procedure professor. But at the same time, I think at that moment, he was really glad that he had treated me well, because I was the person interviewing him. Keeping that in mind, we work in a very small world. You never know who you're going to encounter again, and that shouldn't be the reason that you treat people well, but you should keep that in mind. You never know when that intern that you were unkind to is suddenly going to be the person who you need something from in another capacity. And that I've seen time and time again in my career. Whether I've needed someone or someone else has needed something from me, you want to be that person, as you mentioned, right, that people can rely on, and that they know you're going to treat them well and respectfully no matter what. That I just can't overemphasize that enough, that definitely plays through and can be helpful, right? It can be very, very helpful. So as I mentioned, had the opportunity to serve in the Sentencing Commission Director for about 5 years, and then had the opportunity, got a call from Governor Herbert's office. His previous general counsel had been appointed to the court, and they needed a new general counsel. And suddenly that fell on me. And this is where I come back to the advice that I gave, that no information is ever bad information. So that job, I will say, terrified me when I took it, because I knew, having worked very closely with the previous general counsel, the scope of the issues that were required to be aware of and to work in and to advise the governor on. And mistakes in that area were serious mistakes, right? I mean, if you messed up there, people got hurt. People went to jail. They were very, very serious mistakes. And that terrified me, that I did not have the expertise. I'd been working in a very niche area of the law. I was the Sentencing Commission Director. My specialty was sentencing policy. I was the president of the National Association of Sentencing Commissions. I focused on that area. That's what I did, and that's what I knew. And I was very worried about needing to know the scope of everything else that was there. But because I had taken the opportunity to, one, learn where I could, right, and get involved in things where I could, that was helpful. But the more important thing at that point was that I had established relationships with people across the board, so that when an issue came up, I could call and they would answer the phone, and I could rely on their expertise or have them teach me about a particular area. Never be afraid to do that. People are always willing, with a few exceptions, to share their expertise. If you need to prepare for an interview, if you need to, prepare for something in your job, call someone who knows, right? I mean, they can send you down the right path in doing that. I've had lots of people. In fact, to this day, I no longer advise the governor on judicial appointments, but every time there's an opening, I get calls from lots of candidates asking me to help them navigate that process and share that information. Take advantage of that. People are happy to share the information that they have. It can be a little scary to call them sometimes, but they are always happy to share. In my job working with the governor, so when I was his general counsel, I advised him on legal, ethical issues. I advised his office on the same. I also advised his cabinet members on, in their role as cabinet members, not their agencies necessarily, but on those same kinds of issues. And I was also his legislative director, which meant that my job was to track all of the legislation that was coming before our Utah State Legislature to make sure if there were issues that would either affect the governor's office, affect one of his cabinet agencies, that would be difficult to administer, or was just something that at a policy level the governor fundamentally disagreed with. Because as you know, in our system, right, every bill has to go to the governor for a signature. And our governor doesn't love to veto bills. He would much rather fix them before they get to him if he can, which sometimes people criticize him for. They think he should veto many more things. Again, his process was to engage people early and to work with them to solve problems, which I think was a wonderful policy, but also made my life a little difficult. I was the person who got to spot issues and then call legislators and tell them they needed to fix it. It wasn't always fun, but they did always answer or return my phone calls very quickly because that was always a bit of a red flag. But the opportunity to do that, again, was something that has continued to help enrich my career in that every kind of issue that you can imagine comes before the Utah State Legislature, right? We pass laws on everything from transportation to education to health issues to criminal justice issues to licensing issues for barbers to, I mean, everything you can think of, there are laws about. And so I had an opportunity, and I took this opportunity to learn about every single one of them. And the best part of that was just the number of people that are involved in that process and the number of people I got to interact with and develop those kinds of relationships where I'm in private practice, and I also work with our Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce. Again, I have just a broader network of people I can call and say, I have this issue in this area. Can you help me? Can you help explain this to me? Can you help me figure out how to navigate that? When folks talk about networking, it can sound a bit overwhelming and a little scary. You're not always asking someone for a job when you're networking, right? You just want to, in my mind, you want to know people who at some point or another can be helpful, and being helpful to them in return is very there. People like to use the word quid pro quo. That's not how I like to do it. But when someone calls you, they have a question, they have a problem. If you help walk them through that, they're very likely to be able to willing to do that for you again and again. Often it's just sharing information and their time and their expertise. Any questions about that? So that, just to kind of talk kind of government sector world, there are so many jobs, and I'll divert here just a little bit, that you can do with a law degree, but also with public policy degrees or public administration degrees in the world of government. While I was the governor's general counsel, I was not the only person in the governor's office who had a law degree. At times, his chief of staff also had a law degree. The lieutenant governor has a law degree. His deputy chief of staff has a law degree. As I mentioned, early in my career, I noticed it's a fantastic background for teaching people how to think, how to analyze, how to approach problems. And in the world of government in particular, and in the business world too, even though you may not be a practicing lawyer, for whatever reason, that degree kind of gives you this extra gold star of credibility. People think you know what you're talking about, even when you don't. I advise not taking advantage of that, but some people do. But within the agencies, there were multiple cabinet members who, again, were law trained, had that background, and lots of deputy directors and others who had that category. Any questions about just working in government in general? So not specifically in the prosecutor's office, but just those opportunities in government?
I'm studying to be a music teacher, and I'm interested in creating curriculum. And so I'm interested if you have any experience with like school curriculums and things like that, or if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a lot of different capacities, there are lots of opportunities to do that. So recently, and I'm really grateful for this, the governor appointed me to serve on the Board of Trustees for Utah State, which has been really fun to get to work with that university and look at how they develop different curriculums and programs that are typically approved by the Board of Regents in conjunction with the boards of trustees. So there's lots of opportunities there. I mean, in the world of higher education, you have a little bit more freedom, right? You have the job, you get to develop your curriculum, you get to develop those programs, you get to do research. That works in the world of higher education. In K through 12 world of education, it's a little bit different. You get to work with the local school boards, the State Board of Education, in doing those kinds of things, but there are some really great opportunities to develop programs and curriculums, but they do have to go through and be approved through those particular channels. The world of education is probably one of the toughest ones to work in for a couple of reasons. There are a lot of bosses and there are a lot of interested people. So every parent not only went to school, but has kids in school and thinks they have a level of expertise in how education should work. Every legislator falls into that category as well, right? They all went to school or have kids in school. And so every year there's about 80 to 100 different bills that the legislature passes having to do with education, which can be really tumultuous in the world of education because a school year is fairly finite. And before they get through implementing one set of rules, they come in and add some new ones. So people like to call the Utah legislature the super school board. They kind of come in on top of that and change all these different curriculum. It's tough for folks. Then you have your superintendents in the different districts, right? And then you've got the boards that layer on top of that. So my answer there is there are a lot of places to intersect if you're interested in developing curriculum. Legislators will love to run a bill mandating a particular curriculum. School boards would love to implement them and authorize them. Superintendents love to engage in that area. The state school board loves to do things in that area. So there are just a lot of places to intersect and work in that area. And then again, the higher education system is a whole other area where you have a little bit more freedom to do that. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
So if we're interested in the job, kind of like you're describing in the office of the governor's general counsel, or just working with broad policy in general, what would be some good ways that we could get experience and be involved while still in school?
So when I was general counsel, and this is still the case, there are always internships in the governor's office. And I don't know how many of them, I know they work with BYU to have interns there in the governor's office. There are general interns all year round, which is great, and they do different kinds of things. As general counsel, I didn't always have interns. If I did, they were more often than not law school students. But during the legislative session, and this is still the case, the general counsel's office does have an intern that works very closely with the general counsel throughout the legislative session. I relied very heavily on this intern, and they became very much part of my team. We relied on them to help track legislation, to physically keep track of the bills. There's a physical bill that is aside from all of the electronic things that go through. They sat through all of my meetings with the governor's cabinet, with his senior staff as we would review bills. I relied on them to do a lot of research to help me understand the background of bills. I relied on them every day to track things where they were, so if something happened, they could let me know. That internship is always a great opportunity. I had one or two interns from BYU, I can't recall. And honestly, I don't think they ever got submitted from the university. I think they were applications that people either sent me directly or one of them actually came through a state legislator, someone who they had interned with. The legislature has a fantastic internship program as well. And I've gotten to know a lot of those interns over the years. And in fact, last year, one of those worked with me in the private sector as an intern, someone who I had met who had interned for another legislator. And another one who wanted to I met during the legislative session and really wanted to come in, and so I let come work in my office for a little bit. So there are lots of opportunities to do that, and I can put you in touch with that office if that's something that you're interested in. The Lieutenant Governor's office also, who runs the elections, their department brings in interns as well, and they do get to do a lot of really great work. Other questions in that regard? Okay. So as was mentioned, so I now get to work in the private sector, which is not an opportunity that I ever really thought I would take advantage of. I loved working in government. I love being a public servant. I love getting to solve problems for people. But for little over the last year, I've been working for Ballard Spahr, which is a wonderful law firm. I've been very glad that that's the place that I ended up, which is a national law firm. We have 16 offices across the country. They're headquartered in Philadelphia and have an office here in Salt Lake. I am part of their litigation team, so I do a little bit of litigation. I advise them on different things, and this is the fun part for me, is I get to go into court sometimes just to argue the case for them. I don't have to do the background work, but I get to be there. But I specialize in government relations. So I, on behalf of our firm clients, have the opportunity to represent them with the state legislature or in front of other state agencies on different issues that come before them. So rather than solving the problem, rather than being the person that people call to solve the problems for them, I'm now the person calling and asking other people to help me solve problems. So again, kind of coming full circle. Absolutely. I have the opportunity to represent a diverse group of clients who have a diverse set of issues that come up on a regular basis, but it's been really rewarding. It's a very different type of career with very different pressures. And if, I can talk a little bit about those, but one thing about working for the government is you are in an office and you're advancing the mission of that particular office or that person that you're working for, which is a lot of fun and can be very, very important work. Difference in working for the private sector in a law firm in particular is you have a lot of clients with a lot of priorities, and balancing those different priorities is a very different type of dynamic. As your question about how that can impact your personal life or your family, there are it is a business, and there are hours that you have to bill and so many hours that you have to work, and there are a lot of pressures to bring in work and to be doing that, and that can be very, very taxing, both time-wise and it's just a different type of pressure and stress. But there's also a lot of opportunities outside of government if you still like policy work, which I'm assuming in this world you all do. I have been very pleasantly surprised, and I'm pleased with the opportunities that I've had to serve on different boards and commissions and get involved in campaigns in a way that I couldn't when I was part of the government, but now I can. So I get the chance to advise candidates on different issues. As I mentioned, I get to work with the Board of Trustees for Utah State. I get to serve on the board of directors for and Justice for All, which is kind of the nonprofit group of legal services for the state of Utah, and the Utah Center for Legal Inclusion. And there's lots of just really great things that you get to do from the outside, working with government and pairing with them. To help accomplish all of those different kinds of things. So that's been the most fun thing for me is kind of realizing this world of great work that you can do in the same sphere, but from outside of the government, but with all of those same people. I can go on and on and on and on, and I will if you don't have any questions, but we've got about 4 minutes left, and I just wanted to make sure if there are any other questions that have the chance to answer them. Yes. I can repeat questions too.
So I'm kind of interested in kind of your immediate career path, actually. So I just want to know.
Meandering, though it may be.
Well, yeah. So I just want to know a little bit more about your transition from law school into, because I think you mentioned something about working for a judge.
Yeah.
So just kind of how you came out of school, hit the ground running, and was able to move your career forward from that point.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, for me, and your question was, how do you know if you like this? I went to law school thinking I wanted to do policy work. I had no other plans. While I was in law school, again, discovered that I really liked trial work. We were all required to compete in a trial advocacy competition, and I loved it. And one of my professors really kindly afterwards, he was my judge, and sent me an email and just said, I don't know what your plans are, but if you have any, desire to do this, I think you have a real aptitude here. And so I did trial advocacy throughout law school and discovered I really liked that, and I wanted to spend some time in that area, even though it wasn't my primary career goal. So for me, I kind of switched my plans partway through, and so I did a clerkship with a state court judge just to make sure that that was something that I really liked. And so during that year, I had the opportunity to just do research for the judge, to work really closely with them, help advise them on decisions, research the law, go through those kinds of things, and work with them in that capacity. And then went from there to the district attorney's office because I did like it, and I wanted to be the person actually presenting the cases for a while. But again, there it was really helpful in that the judge, was able to help me connect with the district attorney's office. That had been his previous job. He had not in that county, but in a different county, and so was able to help prepare me for what that would look like and help get me ready for those interviews. and things along those lines. Any other questions? Okay. If not, I will just leave you, again, these are really soft things, but just my strongest career advice, as you work with people throughout your career, be someone who's willing to help. Be someone who's willing to help solve problems. Be someone who brings solutions and doesn't just poke holes. Particularly in the legal field, no matter where you are, it will be a small community. And just always keep in mind that your reputation will always precede you. Judges talk, lawyers talk, whatever it is you're doing, those reputations will follow you forever. So guard that jealously. Make sure you always treat people well, that you're always upfront with them, and that you always follow through with what you'll say you'll do. Thank you.